I first introduced literature in my classroom, the common reply that I got from them is that, teacher, it's boring. So my students thought that the literature is boring. So I asked them, why do you think literature is boring? And then they told me that they cannot understand what they read. So I asked them again, why do you not understand? What's wrong with it? I thought the passage is simple. I thought I'm explaining to you. So why can't you understand? Then they told me this. They are not able to visualize what they read, especially the short stories. So when they are not able to visualize, right, they don't understand the story. And when they don't understand the story, they just regard literature as a whole as boring. So this is something that I always face in my classroom. And of course, to mitigate this, I started with pictures. I started to use pictures in my classroom, and then I started to use videos or short clips about the short story, right? But whenever I do this, the problem is that I'm always giving them the inputs, and I want to change this, right? I don't want to be the type of teacher who always spoon feed my students everything, because this question started to appear on my mind. Until when do I need to spoon feed my students? Because I believe in 21st century learning, we are all trying to make our students to be an independent learners, right? So when we want them to become independent learners, then there's a need for us to change as teachers, right? We need to transform them into something. We need to transform them to think on their own. So because of this reason, I came with this concept, right? Which is to use Minecraft for education to visualize literature. Now, Minecraft for education, right? It is actually a sandbox video game, all right? And I believe even your children or your students are playing it, even without you introducing to them, right? Because it is a video game, all right? Minecraft is a video game. So when it is something that your students are already doing in their classrooms, why not you bring it into your classroom? Why not you adapt it into your lessons? Because when you do this, your students are definitely going to enjoy your lessons because they already play this as a game outside of your classrooms, right? So this is something that I noticed that I can do with my students. Okay, now having said that, there are actually three advantages of why you should use Minecraft in your classroom. Number one, it is student friendly. As I told you, your students are playing it already. So when your students are already playing it, yes, you have to bring it into your classroom to actually make your lessons better. Secondly, it is actually free of charge. All right, you as teachers and your students, you don't have to pay for it because it is free of charge, right? Minecraft for education is free of charge. And number three, it is actually very interactive because I told you, right? It's a game. So when it is a game, there are actually various functions and modes that you can actually use in your classrooms. So there is no problem for you to go through this, right? But of course, before we adapt it into our classrooms, there are a few things that we need to know. And one of it is, of course, our students' proficiency. So when you know your students' proficiency, then you will know how much of information are you going to give them, how much of instructions are you going to give them, all right? And then number two, you need to know as well their interests, all right? Let's say your students have zero interest in the game. So what you have to do is you have to start developing their interest, right? Step by step, right? But let's say your students are already at the peak level of interest. Then you don't have to do the step by step. You can just adapt it into your classroom and ask your students to play, right? So you need to know this as well. Number three, you need to know your students' gadgets, right? If they're actually using headphones or they're using laptops or they have nothing at all, right? So only when you know this, then you can plan better for your students. Next, you have to know how familiar students are with the game itself. Because I believe there are always some students who know this game, who are already playing it, right? So when there are students who are already playing it, you make them the experts in your class, right? So make sure when you do the grouping, you have the experts and as well as students who have never played the game. So these experts can actually help those who are not playing the game, right? Next, you also have to know your students' internet connection, right? You need to know if they have internet connection at home and if that is stable enough, right? Because if your students don't have stable internet connections, then you have to do something with them, right? You have to find ways to solve that, resolve that, right? And lastly, you have to ask yourself as a teacher, how much do you know about the game itself, right? Because only when you master the game, you will be able to explain to your students well, and you can give the best to your students. Now, having said that, let us look into my lesson itself, right? So I used Minecraft for education to teach my Form 2 students, right? And I taught them the short story Cheat by Alan Bailey. So the short story is actually one of the components in our Malaysian syllabus, right? Malaysian literature component syllabus. So I use that to teach this short story. Now, let us look at the lesson itself, right? So I'm going to run you through the summary of my lesson. First thing first, what I did with my students is that I grouped them, right? I put them into groups. So again, in order to group them, I had to know who are my experts and who are the students that they have never used Minecraft before. So when I know these people, then I can group them and make sure that they are all, each group has equal number of students who are experts and also those who are not or who have not played the game at all, right? So when I already group them, second thing I do with them is that I read along the story with them, right? This is very important, right? You cannot skip this phase, right? Because you want to make sure that your students read. Because sometimes when you just give them tasks, some students may not have read the story, right? So just rely on their friends to explain to them. So in order to mitigate this, what you have to do is you have to read along the story with your students. So I also discuss the story in general in terms of these words that they don't understand. If there are any unfamiliar words, I explain to them, but I make sure that I don't give them the entire idea of the short story, right? Because I want them to explore on themselves, right? Next thing I did is that I introduced the task, right? So in this lesson, the task was for the students to develop scenes, right? The scenes from the short story, all right? Let's say they like the first scene of the story. So they will develop, right? They will build the scene, right? They will build the scene in the Minecraft, right? Because Minecraft is a place where they build, right? They build something. So I asked my students to build the scenes on Minecraft, right? So I introduced a task to them. And then I had a presentation, right? So I gave them an ample of time, right? I gave them about 2 weeks to do the task, right? Because the lesson I introduced to them before the school break. So during the school break, they had the time to do the development. And then after it, they presented to me. Now, so this is the task chart that I use with my students, right? Because I don't want them to just do it as it is. I want to see how much they progress, right? And in order to know their progress, this is the task chart that I use with them, right? So these are the components that they have to answer. Number one, they have to tell me in terms of the discussion they had to design, and then how they build the characters, the base, right? The base different the settings, and then when they submit and present, right? So these are the task chart they have to follow. So this task chart has to be filled by every single student, because when you ask your every single student to do it, then you can see, right? You can see and you can correlate between the group members and see whether they actually have the same understanding or they're actually diverting from each other. So when you see diversion between your members, then you can actually go in, step into the group, and you explain to them what they have to do, right? So it is very important for a teacher to know this, right? And then when I already had game developed by the students, right, then I come to this phase of discussion. So just by having the pictures, right, just by having the designs, I was able to go through this phase of discussion. Number one, I was able to discuss the characters, all right. I used the designs that the students did to spark discussion about the character traits, all right. So I get to ask them in terms of the characters analysis, I get to do that with just Minecraft for education. And secondly, I get to do the plot, all right, because I already have the design, the sequence, all right, the scenes. So I just sequence them, then they get to see the story better, they visualize. Then lastly, the settings, because they also developed, right, on Minecraft. So I get to see, right, they get to see the settings of where exactly the story is taking place, right? So eventually, subconsciously, I get to do all this. And yes, just by using Minecraft. So from this lesson, what did I observe from my students? That number one, right, the students became the collaborators in my lessons, right? Because they are now developing the materials. It's no longer me developing the materials, it's them, right? The designs come from them. Secondly, the students work cooperatively in groups. So at the same time, I'm promoting cooperative learning among my students. And then thirdly, students took charge of their learning. All right. So now they are becoming independent in their learning. All right. All I do is that I facilitate them to the task. And lastly, they had improved and broader understanding of the story. Because in order for them to develop, they have to go through all the different settings in the lesson, and they have to understand carefully what's happening. So they become a better understanding, right? They had a better understanding of the story itself. So now, these are some of the works that my students did, right? So the first scene was about this principal announcing the winners. Then this is another part of the scene. And then, yes, I had more, right? So these are some examples that my students did, right? And then, yes, language classrooms need visuals, all right? I really emphasize this, right? From my lesson, I noticed that language classroom needs visuals. And only we have the visuals, the students will be able to understand better. And with that, I'm Divenes Egambaram, a student teacher at SMK Cochrane, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Thank you very much for listening to me.